Okay, let's
Sure that my headphones are working. It sounds like they are. I think they are. Okay, so it's almost 7 o'clock. I'm Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners. We're going to do our Monday night live just like we always do. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Ontario. The sun's shining in on me. My daughter took the night off rugby because she's doing exam week right now. So we had said that we were going to be here live on the Q&A every Monday from the truck and at the rugby game. But for today, I get to hang out on the couch. So let's answer those questions. If you're watching on YouTube, I can see questions. If you type them in, I'll pop in every once in a while and take a look at them. But if you'd like to ask direct questions, come in and talk to me directly, then just pop over to starcam.com/app, download the app. You'll see the live there. You can come in and you can upload a video just like this. Carlene's got a question here. Let's play it.
Look at this politically because Biden's so far underwater.
Hi, Sarah. I got my bread cutter and I absolutely love it. You need to get one. I can get 12 slices out of a loaf of bread. It's pretty impressive. You need to get one. Put that on your wish list.
Carlene, you should show it to us. I don't know if you can set up a video of it. So Carlene has gotten the Zazen House. I think that's how you would say it, bread slicer. This thing is amazing. It's so amazing. It's like this big, and you put your bread up against it and you wheel the wheel and it slices these perfect slices. A girl put a video of it into the group the other day. Carlene, if you can, make a quick video of it slicing it because it's amazing. I do have it in the Amazon store. It's been something I've wanted forever. I'd really like them. So that's a good thing to talk about. Sourdough tools. What are some good tools to have? We always say, that you don't actually need anything special to make sourdough. It's not a requirement. You can usually figure out a way to make sourdough just with what's laying around the house. I certainly started that way. When I first decided to make bread, I was, pretty financially strapped. I didn't have any extra funds to go and buy special things. Very quickly, I bought a scale. The Amazon basic scale that I use in all of my videos is about $10 US. I think it's like $13 here in Canada. I've got it linked basically everywhere on the Facebook page. You can find it in a lot of the descriptions of my YouTube videos as well. It's the first thing I bought, and I will say that while you don't need a scale to make sourdough, it makes things so much easier. All of our recipes that we set up, whether it's our discard recipes or our beginner bread recipe or our level 2 hydration, all of them we've converted to cups, right? We want to make sure that everyone can be included regardless of what they have or don't have. But with the scale, it does a couple of things. One, it makes things quicker, right? Because we're not, fiddling around with measuring cups and measuring spoons and, measuring stuff out, then pouring it into the bowl. We can basically just stick our bowl right on top of the scale and start dumping stuff in. It's very, very accurate. Speaking of accuracy, sometimes when we're measuring with cups, we're packing it a little bit tighter or a little bit looser than we did yesterday. So we're not accurate every single time with our bread. So when you're still learning and you're trying to troubleshoot, the easiest way to troubleshoot is if you know that your process is super consistent, right? So having that scale, that every time there's 1,000 grams of flour in there or there's 500 grams of flour in there, whatever it may be. So it definitely helps for ease of use, but it also helps for that consistency. And the consistency comes in great when you're trying to troubleshoot, right? After that, the next tool that I bought was the Dutch oven. So I had been baking my loaves in loaf pans. I've got a no Dutch oven recipe on the YouTube channel. It works great. The loaf pan loaves work absolutely great. But the easiest way to make perfect sourdough in a home setting in your own oven is to have a Dutch oven. The Dutch oven sort of creates that great environment that will create that oven spring. So that's a good thing to have. And then from there, everything becomes a wish list, right? Do I want a dough whisk? Do I want a Banneton? Do I want a cold proof at all? And then, of course, Carlene got that amazing slicer. So let's see what Rick's got to say here. By the way, if you're on YouTube, please come ask some questions, upload some videos. I'm here to chat. That's what Mondays at 7 are for, questions and answers.
I wonder if they are sharpenable, like if your bread slicer gets dull after a while, like because we would use that a lot. So I wonder if they dull after a while.
You know, they're German made. They have a really good reputation, that Zazenhaus slicer. Let's see. Let's see what we've got here. Oh, we have a video here. Let's check it out.
Hi, what flour do you recommend to mix in? I've noticed it will determine the bulk fermentation process, either speed it up or slow it down. The other question I had
Yeah.
was for bulk fermentation, does it depend on the containers? I have circular containers. Does that make a difference? Or where you place
Good
it?
questions.
I just want to get it nailed down.
A
Thank
lot of
you.
good questions. Great. Okay. So I think you had posted some questions on one of the posts on Facebook, and I invited you. So I'm glad you're here. That's fantastic. Those are really great questions. Okay. So let's start with flour. Sturdy flour, so anything other than all-purpose flour or bread flour is what I would call a sturdy flour, right? So that's your rye, that's your spelt, even oat flour, whole wheat flour. When you start getting into like the ancient grains, all of that, those are sturdy flours. They by nature will soak up more water than all-purpose or bread flour, right? So they're going to affect the hydration of your dough. So what we always suggest is that you never go more than 20% of a mixed in flour while you're baking, especially as a newbie, right? Later on, you can start doing 100% whole wheat loaves once you understand the process. So we've got what we call the essential processes, right? And once you understand those processes, you've got them down, you know what they are, you've troubleshooted your dough, you sort of know what causes what issue, then start adding more doughs or more flours. I think you had mentioned that you were using rye. Rye is a very thirsty flour. It's going to soak up that water really quickly, but it's also a very sticky flour. So when you're trying to stretch and fold it, when you're trying to shape it, it's very sticky. It also tends to rise much faster than all-purpose or bread flour. So what I was hearing when you were explaining the issues that you were having, I think if I remember correctly, your starter is very active. You know it is. It's an established starter that you had purchased dehydrated, so that's a good thing. You're mixing up your dough. You're going through the stretching and folding process. You're bulk proofing. During stretching and folding, it's a little bit sticky, which is sort of indicative of rye. And then after the bulk proofing process, you're sure it's fully doubled, but then it's not holding its shape anymore. Usually when a dough isn't holding its shape, that means that it is overproofed. So what I suggest is that until you get the processes down completely, stay with like 90% or higher all-purpose and bread flour. If you've got rye on hand, throw your rye in there. I personally use spelt. I find spelt to be very inexpensive. You can get the Bob's Red Mill spelt at like Walmart or whatever grocery store you're at, depending on if you're in the States or Canada. It seems to be one of the lower priced heavy-duty flours. And I find that it's a little bit more balanced in how much water it's soaking up. It also has a really excellent flavor. So that's what I use. If I were going to recommend a mix-in flour, which was your initial question, spelt would be what I would recommend. In regards to your bulk proofing containers, circle or rectangular, that doesn't matter so much as what you want is a snug fit for your dough. So mine are well, hang on a second. I'll just grab them and I'll show you a couple of different options that will work great. Just bear with me for one sec here. Let me grab sort of a few examples of all bulk proofing containers that could work just fine. So all of these would work just fine. The key is that we want it to be a snug fit for our dough, right? So this is a 1.75 quart bowl. So I think that's about 7 cups, if I'm not mistaken. It's about 4 inches deep and it's circular, right? So when we put our dough in this, the dough is going to touch on the edges all the way around, right? Then we've got this one. These are the ones that I use most common, and this is a 1.89 liter. So liters and quarts are different, but this one's 8 cups, so slightly bigger than the round bowl, but still small and snug enough that the dough is going to touch all the way around, right? And then here's another example of one that will work. So this one is 1.9 liters. So same size as this, but sort of smaller and taller, right? So these snug fitting bowls work great. And the reason why is that sourdough is not going to just rise straight upwards. First, what sourdough does is it fills in all of the gaps, right? So if you watch any of the videos, especially the live videos that we've got on Facebook, there's live replays on the YouTube channel. There's a whole playlist of live replays. What I always say is to mark the height of your dough. And I don't mean just like, oh, it was here. What I mean is to sort of follow that dough around at the height that it's at. You can sometimes kind of see it left over on some of my bowls. Sourdough will spread sideways first and fill in all of the gaps that there are, and then up. So when we're saying that you want your dough to double if you're going to bake the same day, or go to 0.75% if you're going to cold proof, we want you to take into account the fact that before it started to go upwards in your bulk proofing container, first it filled in all the gaps. So double might not necessarily be total double. So say, for example, this is how high your dough was when you started, right? You would think that double would be like this, but it actually might be more like this, right? Because first it had to fill in those spots. So what you were talking about on the Facebook page earlier was that, it was acting like it was overproofed. And I think what you said is that you were keeping your dough in the microwave with the light on because your house is cold, which is fine. But that kind of heat can actually significantly speed up your bulk proofing. And I mean a lot. Like if your microwave is 98 or 100 degrees inside with that light on, it could reduce your bulk proofing, bulk fermentation time down to like an hour or two, compared to 3 or 4 hours. So I hope that answers your question. So what do we get? We had, what kind of flour should we mix in with? What kind of bulk proofing containers should we use? Let's play it again. Play again.
Hi. What flour do you recommend to mix in? I've noticed it will
Yeah, we
determine
got that.
the bulk fermentation process, either speed it up or slow it down. The other question I had was, for bulk fermentation, does it depend on the containers? I have circular containers. Does that make a difference? Or where you
That's
place
great, as long
it?
as they're snug fitting.
I just want to get it nailed down.
The
Thank
microwave
you.
makes a huge difference. Yeah, okay, good. So we covered it all. So I just got a brand new oven. It has a bread proofing setting, and I've been practicing with it. And I will tell you this, my bread proofing setting on the oven is 98 degrees. My house is usually about 70 degrees, right? We've got air conditioning on. It's summertime now. You can see the sun shining in on me. It's, between 69 and 70 degrees here in the house, right? When I put my bread in that bread proofing stage, it goes from usually taking between 4 to 4.5 hours to bulk proof to taking like an hour and a half or two. So if it's quite warm in your microwave, right, then you're going to have a really fast bulk proofing time, especially if you've got a flour like rye in there, which will also speed up that bulk proofing time. So based on what I was hearing from your end, you're probably going to need to shorten that bulk proofing quite a bit if you're going to keep it in the microwave, which is fine, or possibly take it out of the microwave and let it sit on the counter for that bulk proofing. So I think those were really good questions and really good things to focus on. So yeah, so all of these are acceptable for bulk proofing. Now, the one other thing I'll say is if you are going to work with sturdy flours, then there's a couple of videos that I suggest in the baking playlist on the YouTube channel. So on YouTube, it's just at Sourdough for Beginners. And then once you're in there, you'll see playlists. There's the baking playlist. In the baking playlist, about halfway down, there is a whole wheat 100% whole wheat loaf using the essential processes. So you're still going to use all the same processes, but it's going to start, it talks more in depth about how you need to adjust when you're using these really heavy wheat blends. And then another one that you can look at, particularly with rye flour, is we just recently posted a pumpernickel loaf, which is sort of on the main page up close to the top. I'm not sure if it's in the baking playlist, but if it's not, I'm going to add it. But seeing how rye flour acts and how sticky it gets might help you in that regard too.
Our house is normally
There we
72
go.
degrees Fahrenheit, and the bread proofing setting on our stove is 95, I believe, love.
No, it's 98. It's 98. I I mean, he controls the heat in the house, so I'm always telling him it's way too hot or it's way too cold, and it's actually always just the same. So the temperature, according to Sarah, is based on how she feels, not based on what reality is. I'm willing to admit that, but I do know that the bulk proofing setting on my new oven is 98 degrees, and some ovens have a 100-degree bulk proofing setting. So I do know, and that's a pretty big difference. And then I've seen posts where people have said, I'm using the light on in my microwave, and we have lots of YouTube questions here, and that people have put a thermometer in there and found their microwave can hit like 100 degrees. So it's a big, big difference. So I'm just going to pop over here and do some YouTube questions. So Peggy Schallenberg says, hello, my question is my starter is about 10 days old and rises, but not double after 20-ish hours. So you're getting there. Sometimes it can take up to 3 weeks for a starter to fully activate. It should double completely and consistently after every feed. So it doesn't necessarily have to double within like the recommended 4 to 6 hours that people talk about. But you do want it to double consistently. So the same way after every single feed. Sorry, I'm just getting the sun out of my eyes here. So what you can do at around day 10 is a couple of strengthening measures. So I see that your next question is, I've increased the amount of flour and water that I feed. What can I do? Okay, try increasing the amount of flour, but not the amount of water. So let's just assume you're doing a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, right? So 50 grams each of starter, flour, and water, right? You can keep the 50 grams the same for the starter and the water, but feed it like 75 grams of flour. So what we find is that when a starter is starting to rise a little bit, but isn't doubling, when it's starting to bubble lots, right? But it just needs that sort of boost. What we call a flour heavy feed will help it. So mix it super thick, right? So that's number one. So adjust your feeding just a little bit so that the water and the starter stay the same, but you're heavy on the flour. Another thing that you can do is for only 1 to 2 days, not long term, that you can do what we call twice a day or peak to peak feeding. So you can feed it every 12 hours and discard every time, of course. Or, when it sort of gets as high as it's going to rise, discard it and feed it. Just do that for 1 or 2 days. Sometimes that wakes it up. And then lastly, another thing that you can do is if you're not already using a sturdy flour in your starter, you can add a little bit of whole wheat or a little bit of rye, a little bit of spelt, something a little bit sturdier, and sometimes that'll wake the starter right up. You don't have to feed it that forever. All we're trying to do is get the starter to stabilize. So what you're explaining, by day 10, if it's starting to double a little bit or it's starting to grow a little bit but not quite doubling and bubbling, it's waking up. It's doing what it's supposed to do, but it just needs to stabilize. So I hope those help you. So cloudy. Peggy, sounds like it's just in quiet days, perhaps. It depends on what flour, water, measurements you're using and how much in grams you discard down to. Yes, and Peggy says she's using KA, bread flour. 1 cup flour, half cup spring water to start. Then I discarded, I did by half, by measurements on my jar, and put in half flour and a quarter-ish of water. Okay. That's great. So, and thank you, Cloudy, for saying that about the discarding down. Peggy, make sure that you're discarding all the way back. So you're saying you're going back to a line on your jar, which is great. That's fantastic. But you could discard your starter all the way back to a quarter cup of starter left in the jar. And then you could feed it like 3/4 of a cup of flour and a quarter cup of water. So that's that flour heavy feed, right? And you just want to do that for a couple of days. And then you can go back to discard back to a quarter cup of starter, feed it half a cup of water, and then a quarter cup of sorry, half a cup of flour and a quarter cup of water. So Clyde says, okay, sounds good. Discard down to a quarter cup of starter, feeding a half cup of flour and a quarter cup of water. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, perfect. So Cloudy's just helping along. Thank you. That's awesome. So she's saying, we don't want to discard half. It did. Then I increased my feed. You increased it. I was told it was hungry. Yes. So if your starter smells like acetone or rubbing alcohol or beer, like a very strong nail polish remover smell, then it's probably quite hungry. And that's why we're saying do this flour heavy feed. Yeah, and day 10, it's still just establishing. So it's not doing anything unusual right now. You're doing great. So yeah, so Cloudy's just giving some good advice. Yeah, so Cloudy's saying the same thing. They're saying, just make it really thick. That's what we call a flour heavy feed. So yeah, and we definitely don't recommend saving or using your discard until your starter is doubling consistently after every feed. So just throw it away until then. But as soon as it starts doubling, then it's good to use. So let's pop this down here. So if you've got any questions on YouTube, pop them in and we'll get in there and check them out and get them answered. So lots of good starter questions. So for those of you who are watching and don't understand what we're talking about, flour by volume weighs about half as much as water, or the other way around, water weighs twice as much as flour. So if you're going to make a starter using cups, then you want to use a quarter cup of water to a half a cup of flour. And with the starter, you can sort of choose to do the starter anyway, like the amount that you're leaving behind after you discard. But we consider starter to be more liquid than flour, right? Because it's fermenting. So it starts out 50-50 flour and water, but as time goes on, as it ferments, it liquefies, right? It eventually becomes alcohol. So we choose to make the balance where starter is the same as water. So what we're suggesting is discard back to 1/4 cup of starter every day, feed it half a cup of flour and 1/4 cup of water. Around days 7, 8, 9, 10, if you're trying to sort of push it along and get it to wake up, then you can start to do some flour heavy feeds. So you'll hear it said a few different ways. Some people will say mix it thick, like a really thick pancake batter, or do a dry feed where you make it almost like a dough, right? Or a flour heavy feed, like what we say. So that's one good way to wake up your starter. Another good way is, like we said, to use those sturdy flours to do feeds twice a day. Lots of different things that you can do. So good. Let me just check these comments here and make sure. Peggy says, I don't save it, I throw it out. Yeah, so Peggy, you only have to throw it out until it's alive. Once it starts doubling consistently after every feed, you can save that discard, or you can use it in discard recipes, or you can choose not to discard at all. So I'll go into that in just a second. Cloudy's got a couple of questions here. I'll answer those. And then Peggy, if you're still around, I'll tell you how to manage that discard after your starter has woken up. And for those of you watching here in StarCam, if you've got any questions, upload them and we'll go through. So Cloudy says, I used AP flour for my first few loaves, so AP is all-purpose, but decided to try bread flour to test the bulk fermenting and have found where I live the bread flour is giving me a much better rise and oven spring. Is there a reason for that? I live on the prairies and it can be dry half the day and raining later. So all-purpose flour is your lowest protein flour, right? So the volume of protein that you have in your flour is going to affect the entire environment of the sourdough that you create. So if you're finding that you're getting a better rise and oven spring from the bread flour, it's probably because it's a slightly higher protein content. It's not a huge difference between all-purpose and bread flour, but it's enough of a difference to make a slight change. So that's probably the reason why you're seeing that. So let's just pop back to Peggy. So Peggy, once your starter starts doubling consistently after every feed, and I think it will in a day or two now if you start making these little adjustments that we just talked about, then you have the ability to start deciding what you're going to do with discard. So a couple of things. Once a starter begins doubling consistently after every feed, once you get to that point where you can say, okay, this is for sure an active starter, we suggest that you feed the starter daily for a week or two, even 3, every day. So discard and feed every day, whether you're baking or not, just to continue strengthening that starter, right? After a couple of weeks, the starter will be nice and strong and very consistent. And then you can actually start either choosing to discard or not discarding as much. So you can choose to manage your starter a whole bunch of different ways. But there's a few things that you can do. So number one is you can feed your starter every day and keep it on the counter. So you will either discard your starter into a discard jar for recipes that you're going to make later, like cookies or pancakes or banana bread. There's hundreds of them. I've got a couple of discard recipe books available that you can make them from. Or if you're baking bread that day, then you discard directly into the bread recipe. So that's one way to manage your starter, but it's not necessarily the most efficient way. Another way to manage your starter is to not feed it. So keep just a small base amount, say 50 grams, and store that in the fridge 4 to 12 hours or however long it takes for your starter to rise, or the night before you're going to bake, feed your starter the amount of starter that you're going to need for your recipe. So for example, the beginner bread recipe calls for 120 grams of starter. You can just feed that starter 60 grams each of flour and water, dump the 120 grams into your recipe, then you've got that 50 grams left behind. Just store that in the fridge so you never ever have any discard, right? Then from there you can start to adjust how you're going to do it. If you're baking frequently, then you might feed it a little bit more. If you want to have discard, then you might keep discarding. But you can use active starter in almost all discard recipes, right? So there's definitely lots going there. So Claudia says, okay, thanks. I honestly thought it's because I'm 3,000 feet above sea level. It could be. What is that? Altitude absolutely affects sourdough. What we found, we've got people up in Colorado who are at 6,000 and 7,000 feet, sort of north of Colorado and everything else. We find that high altitude bread tends to bulk proof quite a bit faster. So Alex says, I'm a single person and the discard is a bit much for me, but I hate to feel wasteful throwing it out. So you'd kind of need to throw it out just until the starter activates. Up to that point, it's not a real starter yet. There's all kinds of bacteria that are growing. So I know it's a little bit wasteful at the beginning, but it should theoretically only be, 10 days. So we're talking about a grand total of 2.5, maybe 3 cups total of flour that you throw away. But after that, you can manage the starter the way I was saying. Good. She says, thank you for that. That's really helpful. So good. I'm glad you're here. I'm really glad you're listening in and chatting and asking these questions. Yeah, just keep a base amount. Once your starter is established, you don't have to necessarily maintain the strict 1-to-1-to-1, right? So just choose an amount to keep. So you're a single person. You might be only making a single loaf every time. So you might be taking, say, the beginner bread recipe and cutting it in half. The beginner bread recipe for a single loaf only calls for 60 grams of starter. Even the level 2 hydration for a single loaf only calls for 100 grams of starter. So you could keep 30 grams on hand, right? And then when you want to do a 60-gram loaf, you feed it 30 grams each of flour and water. You dump the 60 grams that you've created into your bread. It leaves 30 behind. If you want to do a 100-gram loaf, you feed it 50 grams each, flour and water. Dump the 100 into your loaf, leave that 30 back behind. So much easier way to manage it so that you don't have so much waste.
So I found data. He was on the whole other side of the sucker, and we're turning around, and we're doing good.
You're
Also,
supposed to ask bread
good
questions.
sourdough questions.
Just
What's your
end it.
favorite technique?
So just in case y'all don't know. So that's Abigail, my beautiful and sweet stepdaughter, who loves sourdough. She loves sourdough. Abigail, my favorite technique is not a technique. My favorite is baking with you, darling. I love it when you and Madison and Lexi and all of my kids stand in the kitchen with me and bake away. Abigail is at the point now where she can feed the starter entirely by herself. She knows exactly how to do it. She doesn't even need me to tell her amounts anymore. And she can entirely mix a loaf with just me reminding her for the amounts that we're going to use. So thanks for that question, Abigail. That was really great. So let's just check in. So Peggy, discard is actually starter. Yeah, discard is actually starter. So all that discard is unfed starter. So the longer it sits, sort of the more it deactivates, right? So when we feed our starter and it doubles and then peaks, eventually it eats through all of the flour that we fed it, it loses its peak, it goes back down, and then it becomes a discard like thing. So, for example, if you had discard in your fridge and say by some horrible thing happening, you ended up with mold on your starter, you can actually just pull discard out of the fridge, feed it, and it'll wake right back up like starter does. So it's just unfed starter. So you can use active starter in discard recipes interchangeably. But if you find a recipe that calls for active starter, you can't necessarily use discard in it because it may or may not still be strong enough, depending on how long it's been sitting there, to do the rise that you would need. So one thing you can do is combine discard and yeast, and that will create the rise, right? So for recipes that need to rise, like sourdough bread, but also like cinnamon buns, like a chocolate sourdough loaf, like dinner rolls, hot dog buns, scones, let's see, bagels, anything that needs to rise needs a rising agent, right? All starter is a handmade yeast that you've made yourself. So you don't need to create a levain or have this big special mother or anything else. You can basically just feed your starter what you want or need it to have for your recipe and dump that straight into your bread and then just leave this starter amount behind, right? Your starter can sit in the fridge for a week or 2 weeks or even a month, as long as it doesn't mold, right? And that starter is still alive. So discard is still very much alive. And the coolest way to notice that is make yourself a really nice pancake mix. Go on YouTube and find my decadent pancakes. They're just loaded with sugar, but so delicious and so much fun. And make yourself the pancake mix and then stick the pancake mix in the fridge overnight and come back tomorrow and you'll see that this was discard, right? It was not active starter at all, but your pancake mix will have risen. And the reason why is because you took this discard that was sort of inactive, but you gave it a bunch of flour and water and maybe some maple syrup and butter, all kinds of stuff for it to feed on. So it reactivates the starter all over again. So that was a really good question. We always get lots of questions about discard. I think the biggest thing that I think that the reason sourdough is such a big thing right now is because it seems so hard at first. And it is kind of hard at first, right? But the reality is that it can be simplified. And if you understand what the basic processes are, you can start to wing it, right? You can start to work it into your schedule. The reality is that there's a ton of information out there and lots of it's conflicting and most of it's valid, right? So I know that sounds like a conundrum, but it's just a fact, right? There's all of this information out there about sourdough. Sometimes it's conflicting. So for example, you will hear people say, don't put a lid on your starter because it has to breathe. And then you hear people like me say, no, absolutely seal your starter with a tightly fitting lid to prevent mold, right? A starter that can get some good airflow will thrive, right? Air is part of what that movement of air and the escaping of gases and the carbon dioxide buildup that's in there. That's a great thing, right? So a starter that has a breathable lid and never molds is doing great, right? But a starter that has a tightly sealed lid and never molds is also doing great too. So what we suggest is that you sort of find the set of techniques that you want to use, right? One of the things that we're seeing a ton of right now is what we call lazy sourdough. So people are basically just mixing up. They're not their starter. They're saying it's an unfed starter, but it's probably been fed fairly recently. At some point, they have to have fed it in order for there to be any starter there to use, right? So unfed starter, but likely fed within the last 5 or 6 days at most, right? And they're just mixing up their dough. They're not stretching and folding. They're letting it just bulk proof, and then they're baking it, right? And some people are finding that it's working fantastically well, and some people are finding that it's an epic fail. Well, probably the reason that the ones that are failing is because that starter is way unfed, right? Just not strong enough to rise it anymore. So it's not so much that it's a wrong way or a right way to do something or a great way or a bad way. It's that it isn't necessarily acknowledging what the environment is. So the basis of my teaching for beginners is a basic set of essential steps that basically guarantee that you can be successful. I'm not saying that there's steps that you have to do. I'm not saying that the sourdough isn't good if you don't do these steps. What I'm saying is that these steps are consistent enough that and sort of valid enough in the sourdough world, actually have a function that if you follow these steps, you've got a really good chance of success, right? So the essential processes are an active starter. For me, I feed my starter before bed and I mix in the morning. So I suggest an active starter. The biggest issue I have with people saying unfed starter is like, but how unfed? You know what I mean? How unfed is your starter? So an active starter. Then I say mix your dough to mix a shaggy dough. So just dissolve the starter in water, throw in your flour, throw in your salt. Doing things like auto leasing, where you mix your flour and your water and then add your starter later and then add your salt later. Those are great. Those are good things. They really they have functions and they matter. Also, creating a levain has a function and it matters, but it's a little bit more advanced than you need as a beginner. You don't need to do that. So just the basic essentials. So we've got our active starter. We've tossed all of our ingredients into the bowl. We've made a shaggy dough. Now we're going to let it rest for about 30 minutes and stretch and fold it and repeat that 4 times, right? Stretching and folding is building strength in our dough. And as you stretch and fold, especially if it's your first time, you're actually going to notice the dough getting stronger, right? You're going to notice that for the first time you stretch and fold, it'll come way up high and it'll rip and it'll tear. And by your last stretch and fold, it's actually like an elastic bowl, right? There's lots of ways to know that you've built enough strength. It doesn't always take for stretch and folds. Sometimes it takes less, sometimes it takes more. But if you just do 4 sets of 30 minutes rest and stretch and fold, then you can probably think that you're going to be okay, right? So basic essential steps. After we've done stretching and folding, pop our dough into a snug fitting, clear, straight-sided container so that we can watch our dough grow. Remembering that our dough is going to expand sideways first and fill in all of the gaps, and then it will go up. So when we're saying that we should double our dough, it's not necessarily a straight double from what the height is. It's probably ends up looking like a little bit less. We can look for sort of it being touching on all edges, seeing some nice bubbles in the sides, a little bit domed on top, some nice bubbles on top. That's probably a fairly well proof dough. At that point, we pre-shape our dough, let it rest. We put a final shape on it, and then we have the opportunity to either cold proof it, which is an optional step, or bake it right away. regardless, whether we've cold proofed or we're baking right away, we need to put a functional score on. So a functional score is about a half an inch deep or a centimeter deep, and it extends all the way from one end of the dough to the other end of the dough. And the purpose of that is to allow steam to escape during oven spring, right? Oven spring is where your dough sort of has all of this gas built up in it. The heat is high enough that the gas is sort of bubbling inside, and then pop, the dough springs, right? And we need to let that escape. If you don't cut a score, it's just going to escape where it wants to, right? Decorative scores are optional. They're very shallow. You don't have to have them. Cooking times vary widely by oven. People always say, well, how do I cook it? And I always say, you really are going to have to test out your own oven. The safest way to start is to cook it at 450 degrees the whole time. I like to preheat my Dutch oven for a really long time before I put my bread into it, but that's totally up to you. I usually do 30 minutes with the Dutch oven lid on, and then after about 15 minutes with the Dutch oven lid off, I start using my meat thermometer and checking the temperature of the bread. Ultimately, what you want is to cook your bread to 205, between 205 and 210 degrees Fahrenheit. If you get it to that temperature, then it's fully cooked and you're good to go. You can cook at 500 at first and then reduce it down to 450. You can cook in a loaf pan, right? You can do all sorts of things. As long as you get that bread to 205 Fahrenheit and it's a high enough temperature to encourage that spring and pop, you're going to be good to go with your sourdough. So let's just see here, check our YouTube comments. Okay, so pretty good questions tonight, actually. I'm really glad all of you came. I'm happy that you're here. It looks like it's slowing down, so I'll just say if you've got any more questions, get them up in the next minute or two, and we'll get them answered, and then we'll sign off for the night. I'm really glad. I love these question and answers. For those of you on YouTube, I super encourage you to come over to StarCam, upload the video questions, have a chat, show me what's going on. Carlene, you have to show me that Zassenhaus slicer working at some point, but you're usually here every Monday. So if you don't get it done today, we'll do it next week. If you are just sort of new and just starting to learn sourdough, definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's tons and tons of videos there. And I think we're good. I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. So I think we're good. So thanks for being here. I'm Sarah from Sourdough for Beginners, and we'll talk to you all again next Monday at 7 Eastern. Bye for now.